Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about two of my favorite lower body exercises. And the reason these are my favorite is not because they're fun to do, it's not because I enjoy them, it's because from a stimulus to fatigue ratio, these two exercises are absolutely phenomenal. They are absolutely phenomenal. And I'd go so far as to say that if you really wanted two exercises to truly develop your lower body, these two represent excellent foundational lifts, at least from an assistance movement perspective. Now, I would never tell people not to squat and deadlift at all. You guys know I would never say that. But there's a thing that we have to be realistic about. And it comes down to things like axial loading. And we know that having heavy weights up on top of your spine carries its own recovery issues, right? There are different fatigue issues associated with that. And what I want to state up front, though, is that most people are not really at the risk of overtraining as they think they are. In other words, most people can handle more training volume than they really think they can before they overtrain. So I don't want to promote this idea that overtraining is something that's very easy to do. But I think something that people also have to think about, and it's something that we have to look at with a lot of the literature and stuff that's out there, is that there can quickly come a point where when training loads start to become excessive, that we don't overtrain, but we actually see less muscle growth in some cases, right? Like we look at some of these German volume studies done on women. There were actually reasonably well done studies, and I might not agree completely with their findings, but I have to admit that the studies themselves, I might not like the way they set up the variables, but they were well done studies. In terms of gathering scientific data and making a real effort to gather accurate data, they did a pretty good job. What they started finding is that when we start dealing with a lot of these big movements, when we start exceeding about 10 sets in a workout, guess what? People see less muscle growth. With experienced lifters, right? With experienced lifters. And in some cases, on some of the exercises, they don't see anything beyond 5 sets. In other words, they had muscles that when you did more than 5 sets of big serious movements for them in a workout, they saw no additional muscle growth. And that when you went past 10, you went to 15, you saw less muscle growth. And you went to 20, you usually saw even less muscle than with 15. So in other words, you start seeing, with additional training volume, you start seeing less muscle growth. It's not that you don't grow. It's not overtraining. But there are definitely issues with the stimulus to fatigue happening there. Right? There are definite issues. And particularly when we get into the big structural exercises, the exercises that we think of as doing the most good, because realistically, squats, deadlifts, particularly if we pick versions of the deadlift to where we can get a little more muscle recruitment involved, things like deficit pulls, sumo pulls. A lot of these things, they bring a lot to the table in terms of just hypertrophy through the whole body. Deep squats in particular, my God, per unit of training done per set, on a set per set basis, deep full range of motion back squats produce phenomenal hypertrophy results. Absolutely phenomenal. Till you do more than a few sets. And then they bury you. Not so much as a novice lifter, but as you get stronger. And here's what it comes down to. It has to do with the axial loading pressing on your spine. Okay? It has its own recovery and fatigue issues, right? It creates more fatigue than doing the same exercises with the same muscle involvement without the loading on the spine. Now, we could argue we need some of that. And the other problem is that people say, well, couldn't you just go lighter to get less loading on the spine? Well, no, because then you have to do more reps. So you take 450 pounds and drop down to 315 and have that on your spine, but for a lot more reps. You have it for a much, much longer time. That's not helping either, is it? It's not helping. We can get around a lot of that by doing dynamic effort work. One of the big perks that no one wants to talk about is the axial loading reduction on dynamic work relative to the total number of sets and the stimulation. That's actually a minor benefit of it. It's a minor benefit. A little bit less axial loading while still using these amazingly high stimulus movements. But axial loading is a big deal. And it really can make it difficult for lower body movements. Now, a lot of people say, well, couldn't people just do machines? Well, no, they don't remove it either, right? Realistically, most machines, they don't remove the axial loading or the stress on the back. I mean, a leg press, you load your lower back. In fact, plenty of people have permanently injured their lower back doing heavy leg presses, right? Other squat machines still put the weight up on top of you. You're not getting away from the axial loading or the fatigue on your spine or risk of injury or anything else necessarily. And I'm not saying these machines don't have their place. They can certainly have their place in even serious strength training. But let's come over and look at these exercises. All right, you see me doing the hip belt squat. Now, I don't have a hip belt squat machine. If it was in my budget and I had the space for it, sure. But I mean, I'm pretty heavily invested in my home gym. And I do have limited space to some extent, right? I have limited space to some extent. And I'm not made of infinite money either. You know, even if all this is tax deductible, so I've got limits. But hip belt squats, and people say, well, how are you doing that? You don't have the machine and that's just done freely. Yeah. In fact, actually, I had Chris Duffin look at these. He saw me doing these and actually commented this is, in his opinion, the correct way to do a hip belt squat. He prefers this. Like, he thinks this is the technique I'm using on these is great. Like, he gave me props for that, and I appreciated that. But what do you see me doing? I'm using a Spud Inc. hip belt. I'm running a chain through it with eye hooks on it, and I'm running it through my plates. And I get up on top of a pair of 12-inch boxes and do them. And I use the safety arms in my rack to climb up on to get up there. And I do a wide stance. Why the wide stance? We recruit the most muscle fibers. Just like a wide stance squat brings more muscles into play than a narrow stance. That is a fact, by the way. That is not a controversial statement. Studies have shown it pretty consistently. The biomechanics shows it pretty consistently. That's not debated by anyone who knows the data. The wider stance brings more muscles to play. Do a wide stance on it, but the weight is hanging around your waist. Your hips are in traction. And in fact, if you put the belt in the correct spot, it can actually train you to set your hips in a better position. Right? It sets your hips in a very, very good position for unloading the spine. We have zero axial loading on a movement that is capable of fully replicating a deep squat as far as the lower body is concerned. Everything from the pelvis down, the movement pattern is identical to a power squat. Identical. The muscles are used the exact same way. The difference, no axial loading. We don't deal with the same fatigue. So we can develop the entire lower body, glutes, quads, adductors, abductors, everything the exact same as a squat. But we can recover from it so much easier. And besides, we can do other work for our back and our core and everything. And we should, and I do. But I also pick movements that are easy to recover from there also, right? Okay. This lets us get all the benefits of a squat in the lower body without the additional recovery issues of loading the spine. Also for people with a back injury, it's phenomenal. But we're in traction. Some people argue, and I don't necessarily agree with it always on this movement, that may enhance recovery. But then we have the reverse hyperextension, which you also see me doing, which absolutely pulls the spine into traction. That is a restoration and recovery tool. Okay, this is an exercise that if used correctly and if you train it hard, will build your erectors, your glutes, your hamstrings very, very effectively. I'll go so far as to say that I have never been able to replicate the feeling I get in my glutes on this exercise with anything else I've done. And including 450-pound hip thrust for high reps, 500-pound glute ridges for sets of 10, all that stuff. None of it replicates what I get on these. But it pulls your spine into traction. It helps with recovery. It's a phenomenal restoration tool that builds the entire posterior chain, and it's therapeutic. Right? This is both a strength and muscle builder as well as a therapy tool. It's absolutely phenomenal. What happens when we combine these two together? When we combine these two together, we have a pair of movements that will build the entire lower body, starting with the erectors down, completely, effectively, that are extremely easy to recover from, They have a traction nature to them. They're therapeutic, and you can tolerate very high volumes of training with a very large amount of muscle activation. All right, this combination is amazing. Absolutely amazing. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.